If you've ever gotten out of bed too fast and felt the room tilt for a second, or reached for your coffee before your feet even hit the floor, stay right here. What I'm about to walk you through isn't about willpower, and it isn't about some drastic lifestyle overhaul. It's about 4 small windows of time, all packed into your first hour awake, where your heart is quietly doing more work than at almost any other point in your day, and most people have never had a single one of them explained clearly. Welcome to Prime Health Insights, where the next 20 to 25 minutes can quietly protect you from a mistake most people over 60 make without ever knowing it. For over 2 decades, I've worked with patients navigating exactly this stage of life, and today I'm giving you all 4 habits in order, starting right now. The third one tends to surprise people the most. The fourth is the one I see skipped more than any other. And if this is useful, take a second to subscribe, because that's exactly what Prime Health Insights is built for: calm, practical guidance you can actually use. The first habit is jumping out of bed the instant you wake up. I think of a patient like Harold, 69 years old, who had done the same thing every single morning of his adult life. Alarm goes off, feet hit the floor, straight into the day, no pause, no exception. He'd done it that way for 50 years without a second thought, and honestly, it had never once caused a problem, which is exactly why he never questioned it. One morning, standing up out of bed exactly the way he always had, he felt the room tip sideways, his vision grayed out at the edges, and his knees simply gave out from under him. His wife heard the fall from the kitchen and came running, heart pounding, not knowing for a few terrifying seconds whether she was about to find something far worse than what it turned out to be. By the time the ambulance arrived, Harold was conscious again, embarrassed more than anything, insisting he was fine and that they were making too big a deal out of it. But the ER doctor who examined him that morning asked him one question that changed how he thought about every morning since. What were you doing in the 10 seconds before you stood up? The answer, of course, was nothing, and that was exactly the problem. Here's what almost nobody explains clearly. When you go from lying flat to standing upright quickly, gravity pulls blood downward into your legs almost instantly, and your cardiovascular system needs a moment to adjust, tightening blood vessel tone and raising your heart rate slightly to keep blood flowing adequately to your brain. In a healthy body, this adjustment happens automatically, but it takes a few seconds to catch up. Doing it abruptly asks your system to make that adjustment on its own, unsupported, at the exact moment it's least prepared for it. Doctors call this orthostatic hypotension, and it becomes noticeably more common with age, not because something is wrong with you, but because the reflex that used to be instant simply gets a little slower to respond over the years. It's the same way a lot of automatic reflexes soften gradually as we get older without anyone ever pointing it out directly. That's why this simple habit matters much more than most people realize. It's worth knowing what this actually feels like, since it's easy to write it off as simply not being a morning person. A brief graying or dimming of vision when you stand, a few seconds of unsteadiness, or a fluttering feeling in your chest right after getting up are all common signs of this adjustment being rushed. Most people experience a mild version occasionally, and that's nothing to be alarmed by. But if it happens most mornings, or if it's ever severe enough that you genuinely worry about your balance, that's specific, useful information to bring to your doctor. It may point to a medication that needs adjusting, or simply confirm that this exact habit change is worth prioritizing before it becomes a bigger issue than a few seconds of grogginess. Paying attention now can prevent a much bigger problem later. The fix costs you almost nothing. When you wake up, sit on the edge of the bed for 1 to 2 minutes before standing, let your feet touch the floor, take a few slow breaths, and give your blood pressure and heart rate a brief window to catch up before asking your body to fully transition to standing and moving. The mistake most people make is treating this pause as unnecessary or something only frail people need, when really it's the difference between rushing your body's adjustment period and letting it do its job the way it's designed to. Most people, when they hear Harold's story, assume the lesson is Get up more carefully if you're frail. That's not quite it, and it's worth correcting directly because it's the wrong takeaway. Harold wasn't frail. He walked 3 miles most days, mowed his own lawn, carried groceries up 2 flights of stairs without thinking twice about it. This wasn't a story about weakness. It was a story about a reflex that had simply gotten a fraction of a second slower over the years in a body that was otherwise doing everything right. Now, here's something almost nobody connects to that pause, and it's the reason this whole video exists. That brief unsteadiness Harold felt isn't random, and it isn't unique to him. It's tied to a much bigger pattern happening in your body every single morning, whether you notice it or not, and understanding it is what makes habits 2, 3, and 4 make sense in a way they wouldn't otherwise. Cardiac events, heart attacks, strokes, and sudden irregular heart rhythms aren't spread evenly across the 24 hours of the day. Researchers have observed this pattern for a long time now, with a noticeable clustering of cardiovascular events in the first several hours after people wake up. The reason most often pointed to is something doctors call the morning blood pressure surge, a natural, healthy rise in blood pressure, heart rate, and stress hormones as your body shifts out of sleep. For most people, most mornings, that surge is nothing to worry about because it's simply your body switching itself on. But for some people, especially those already managing blood pressure or heart health after 60, that same surge is the exact window where the heart is under the most natural strain of the entire day. It's under more strain than at lunch, more than during exercise, and more than almost any other point you'd expect. Picture your cardiovascular system overnight, like a river flowing gently at low volume while you sleep. Your heart rate slows, your blood pressure dips, and everything settles into a quiet, steady rhythm. Waking up is like a dam opening all at once, sending a faster, more forceful volume of water back into that same river within just a few minutes. That surge is necessary because it's what gets you upright, alert, and moving through your day. But a river that's just received a sudden rush of water is also more vulnerable right at that moment to pressure on its banks than it is once it's flowing steadily. Your blood vessels experience something similar, particularly if they've stiffened somewhat over the years, which becomes more common with age as a normal, gradual process rather than a sign that anything is broken. You might reasonably ask why this becomes more relevant after 60 specifically, rather than mattering equally at every age. Part of the answer is that the underlying surge itself doesn't change dramatically as you get older, because it's roughly the same mechanism at 30 as it is at 70. What changes is your body's margin for handling it. Blood vessels that have accumulated even mild stiffness over the decades, a heart that may already be managing elevated blood pressure or cholesterol, and a nervous system reflex that responds a beat slower than it used to, all shrink the cushion you have for absorbing extra strain. The surge stays the same size. The room you have to handle it gets a little smaller. That's the whole story in a single sentence, and it's the reason these 4 habits matter more now than they did 20 years ago, even if you're doing exactly what you've always done. Here's the part that should genuinely give you pause. Every single morning, millions of older adults are unknowingly adding extra strain onto a heart that's already working overtime before breakfast even happens. It happens before the day has technically started and before anyone around them has any idea it's occurring, not through anything dramatic, but through habits so ordinary nobody thinks to question them, repeated so consistently that they become invisible. They're the kind of routines you stop noticing the same way you stop noticing a sound that's been playing in the background for years. Which brings us to habit 2, and this is the one that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it laid out this plainly. I used to think coffee itself was the problem. It isn't, timing is. I think of a patient like Dorothy, 72, whose morning coffee had been the very first thing she reached for as long as she could remember, often before a single sip of water, and sometimes still half asleep, with a mug in her hand, before her eyes had fully adjusted to the light. She'd tell you, if you asked, that she didn't even taste the first few sips most mornings because it was more ritual than beverage at that point. She wasn't drinking too much coffee. She wasn't drinking bad coffee. She was drinking it at exactly the wrong moment. And nobody had ever told her that moment mattered as much as it does. Caffeine is a stimulant that activates your sympathetic nervous system, the same fight-or-flight system already ramping up as part of your natural morning surge. Research has consistently shown caffeine produces a measurable, short-term rise in both blood pressure and heart rate shortly after it's consumed, an effect that tends to be more pronounced in people who don't drink caffeine regularly and somewhat blunted, though not eliminated, in habitual coffee drinkers like Dorothy. The concern isn't that coffee is dangerous for most people with healthy hearts, it's that drinking it the instant you wake means caffeine's own stimulating effect lands directly on top of the surge already underway, instead of after that initial surge has had a little time to settle on its own. The fix doesn't require giving up coffee at all, and that's worth repeating because a lot of people hear coffee and heart in the same sentence and assume they're about to be told to quit. You're not. Drink a full glass of water first thing when you wake, then give yourself 20 to 30 minutes before your first cup. If you're on blood pressure medication, this is worth mentioning to your doctor specifically, since certain medications and caffeine sensitivity can interact in ways worth understanding individually rather than guessing about on your own. If you're a caregiver or family member rather than the person managing this yourself, mornings are a genuinely useful window to pay attention to from the outside. Someone who seems unusually winded, pale, or unsteady, specifically in the first half hour after waking but seems perfectly fine an hour later, is showing a pattern worth mentioning to their doctor. That pattern points directly at this specific morning window rather than something happening throughout the day. Here's a nuance worth sitting with for a second because it explains why two people can have completely different experiences with the exact same cup of coffee. Someone who's had a cup of coffee every single morning for 40 years has built up a degree of tolerance to caffeine's stimulating effect, which blunts the spike somewhat, though it doesn't eliminate it entirely. Someone who only drinks coffee occasionally or who's recently cut back and is starting again tends to feel a sharper rise. Neither situation makes the timing adjustment less worthwhile. It simply means some people notice the difference immediately after making this change, while others notice it more gradually, and that's completely normal, not a sign the habit isn't working for you. Quick pause here. Has your own doctor ever specifically talked with you about the timing of your morning coffee, not just how much you drink? Drop a comment and let me know either way. You might be surprised how many people watching this have never had that specific conversation, even after discussing blood pressure at length otherwise. Now stay with me, because habit 3 is the one that changes how people think about their entire routine, not just their heart health, and it's the one I get the most messages about afterward. The third habit is taking an extremely hot or extremely cold shower immediately after waking. And here's something almost no cardiologist says out loud in a normal conversation, because it sounds almost too simple to matter. Your shower temperature is not just a comfort preference, it's a cardiovascular event every single time. I think of a patient like Frank, 70, who took real pride for years in starting every morning with an intensely hot shower, the hotter the better, as a way to wake himself up fast, almost like a badge of toughness he'd carried since he was young. One morning, stepping out of a shower he'd run hotter than usual, he felt his vision swim, reached for the towel rack to steady himself, and sat down hard on the edge of the tub, heart pounding, genuinely unsure for a few seconds what was happening to him or whether he should call out for help. Nothing catastrophic occurred that day, but it was the moment that finally made him ask why, after 70 years of the exact same shower routine, this was suddenly happening now. Very hot water causes blood vessels near the skin to widen rapidly, which can cause blood pressure to drop somewhat suddenly, particularly as you step back out into cooler air afterward. Very cold water does close to the opposite, triggering a rapid constriction of blood vessels and a sympathetic nervous system response similar in nature to the fight-or-flight activation we discussed with caffeine, temporarily raising blood pressure and heart rate. Either extreme on its own is a manageable adjustment for most healthy cardiovascular systems, but layering either one directly onto an already active morning surge asks your blood vessels to make another significant rapid adjustment during a window when they're already working harder than usual. It's a second demand stacked right on top of the first. The fix is genuinely simple. Use a lukewarm shower, particularly for the first several minutes, rather than jumping straight to an extreme temperature the moment you step in. If you enjoy a hotter or colder shower as part of your routine, you don't necessarily need to give it up. Save the more extreme temperature for later in your shower, once you've eased into it, and your body has had a few minutes to catch up with the rest of the morning. If you have any diagnosed heart condition, uncontrolled blood pressure, or a history of stroke, this is a conversation worth having directly with your doctor. Sudden temperature extremes can carry different levels of risk for different people, and a personalized answer is always more useful than a blanket rule. That's why individual guidance matters more than general advice. This is also worth mentioning if you've seen the recent trend of cold plunges and ice baths becoming popular for their supposed energizing and anti-inflammatory benefits. For a younger, healthy cardiovascular system, that kind of deliberate cold exposure is generally well tolerated, and plenty of people genuinely enjoy it. But most of that trend was built around and studied in younger populations, and it says very little about whether jumping into extreme cold immediately upon waking makes sense for someone managing blood pressure after 60. It's not that the practice is inherently reckless. It's that a habit designed for one body doesn't automatically transfer safely to another. This is exactly the kind of detail worth a direct conversation with your doctor, rather than relying on a general online trend. Here's why this matters more with age specifically, and it isn't the reason most people assume. It's not that your heart gets weaker. It's that your blood vessels lose a bit of their flexibility over time, a normal part of aging, which means the same rapid adjustment a younger cardiovascular system handles easily can ask more of a system with less flexibility to work with. Many people who switch to a lukewarm start notice within just a few days that they actually feel steadier and more clear-headed. Getting out of the shower rather than the brief lightheadedness some people experience after a very hot one. That alone tends to be enough to make the habit stick. Now here's the fourth habit, and I want you to really pay attention to this one because it's the piece almost everyone skips. It's not because it's hard, it's because it doesn't feel urgent, and that's precisely what makes it dangerous to ignore. The fourth habit is not drinking water after waking. This one is different from the first three. The others are about removing an extra stressor from a system that's already under load, while this one is about actively giving your cardiovascular system support during the exact hour it needs it most. Here's why it gets ignored so consistently. There's no obvious sensation prompting you to drink water first thing the way thirst prompts you later in the day. So it's easy to reach for coffee or simply start your routine without giving hydration a single thought morning after morning for years without ever noticing the pattern. But overnight, even during normal sleep, you lose a meaningful amount of fluid simply through breathing and the body's ordinary overnight processes. You also go roughly 7 or 8 hours without replacing any of it. That mild overnight fluid loss means your blood volume is already slightly reduced right as your body is asking your cardiovascular system to manage a significant pressure surge. It's one more layer of demand onto a system that's already working harder than it will for the rest of the day. That's why hydration matters more in the morning than many people realize. You don't need an elaborate hydration protocol. A full glass of water, roughly 8 to 12 ounces, as the very first thing you do upon waking before coffee or anything else, supports healthy blood volume right as your cardiovascular system navigates its most demanding hour. It pairs naturally with the pause from habit 1, giving your body a moment to hydrate and stabilize before you're up and moving through your day. If you take a diuretic or a blood pressure medication that affects fluid balance, mention this habit to your doctor, not because it's dangerous, but because your individual fluid needs may differ slightly from a general recommendation. Your doctor can tell you if any adjustment makes sense given your particular medications. A simple way to gauge whether this is already a gap in your routine without overthinking it is to notice how you typically feel in the first 20 minutes after waking before that first cup of coffee has had a chance to do anything. A mild headache, a slightly dry mouth, or a general sense of sluggishness that coffee seems to fix almost too well can sometimes be your body's ordinary response to that overnight fluid loss, rather than something caffeine is actually solving. That's not a diagnosis. It's simply a pattern worth noticing over a few mornings, because if water alone quietly resolves it, that tells you something useful about what your body actually needed in the first place. A practical tip that makes this easier to actually stick with is to keep a glass or bottle of water on your nightstand the night before, so it's the very first thing you see upon waking rather than something you have to get up and find. Small friction points, like having to walk to the kitchen first, are often the difference between a habit that sticks and one that quietly falls away after a few days of good intentions. Sometimes the smallest changes are the ones that last the longest. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with something you can bring to your very next doctor's appointment. I call it the Morning Heart Safety Checklist. 5 questions any good physician will welcome, and each one exists for a specific reason. The first question is this: based on my blood pressure history, is my morning surge something we should specifically be monitoring? And would home readings right after waking be useful? This question matters because most blood pressure checks happen in the middle of the day during an appointment. That tells your doctor almost nothing about what's happening in that first hour after you wake up. The second question is, given my current medications, is there anything about morning timing, coffee, showers, or getting up that I should be handling differently? Some medications interact specifically with the morning surge in ways that are easy to miss unless you ask directly. The third question is, have I experienced dizziness or lightheadedness upon standing, and if so, is that something we should evaluate further? This is the question most people skip because they've quietly written the symptom off as normal aging. The fourth question is my current caffeine intake and timing appropriate given my blood pressure and heart health specifically? Not whether you should quit coffee, but whether the timing itself needs adjusting. The fifth question is, are there warning signs specific to the morning hours, such as chest discomfort, sudden weakness, or vision changes, that I should treat as an emergency rather than waiting to see if they pass? Knowing those answers before you ever need them is always better than trying to figure them out in the moment. If your doctor brushes off those 5 questions, that tells you something too about how closely your morning routine is being factored into your overall heart health conversation. None of these questions ask your doctor to do anything dramatic. They're simply designed to connect the dots between your existing blood pressure history, your current medications, and this one specific hour we've spent today walking through together. Here's your challenge for the next 30 days. Build these 4 small adjustments into your morning one at a time, if that feels more manageable than trying to change everything at once. Sit on the edge of the bed for 1 to 2 minutes before standing. Drink a full glass of water before your first cup of coffee, waiting 20 to 30 minutes in between. Then start your shower lukewarm rather than at an extreme temperature. Treat all 4 of these as one connected morning routine instead of 4 separate rules to remember and juggle. Write down today how you typically feel in the first few minutes after waking, whether that's energized, foggy, occasionally lightheaded, or whatever's honest. Revisit that same question in 30 days. You don't need a perfect morning, you need a consistent one. If you'd like to track this more concretely rather than relying purely on how you feel, a simple home blood pressure cuff used right after your 1 to 2 minute pause on the edge of the bed gives you an actual number to compare over time. You don't need anything elaborate. Even a basic reading once every few mornings, noted in a small notebook or your phone, gives you and your doctor real data to look at together at your next visit instead of a vague sense that things have improved. If you're sitting there realizing you already do 2 or 3 of these, good, that matters, and it's worth acknowledging directly rather than glossing over. This isn't a video designed to make you feel like you've been doing everything wrong. Most people already have at least one piece of this in place without realizing it was protective. The goal today was simply to fill in whichever piece was missing, so all 4 habits are working together, instead of 1 or 2 carrying the weight alone. There is a real difference between health care that reacts to a cardiac event and health care that quietly reduces the odds of one ever happening. Mornings, specifically that first hour after waking, are exactly where that difference plays out, day after day, whether anyone is paying attention to it or not. So much of cardiovascular care understandably focuses on the big levers like medication, major dietary changes, and structured exercise programs. Those matter enormously, and nothing here is meant to replace any of them. But this morning window is one of the few places in medicine where a genuinely small 5-minute adjustment intersects directly with a well-documented period of measurable cardiovascular demand. That combination of low effort paired with a specific, well-understood window of vulnerability is rare enough that it's worth taking seriously, precisely because it costs you nothing to try starting tomorrow. Harold didn't need a new diet the morning he ended up on the floor of his bedroom. He needed 60 extra seconds sitting on the edge of the bed. Dorothy didn't need to give up coffee. She needed 20 more minutes and a glass of water first. Frank didn't need to stop enjoying hot showers. He needed the first few minutes to be gentler than the rest. 3 completely different mornings, 3 completely different habits, and the exact same lesson underneath all of them. Your heart doesn't ask for a new diet tomorrow morning. It asks for 1 extra minute before you stand. You've probably never thought of your morning routine as a genuine piece of your heart health, something separate from diet, exercise, or medication. That's not the full picture, and it's not what I've seen in over 20 years of working with people exactly like you. You're not doing anything wrong by how you've started your mornings until now. Most people have simply never had this specific window explained to them clearly. You have every right to understand what your body is doing in that first hour. You have every right to make it a little easier on itself, starting tomorrow, with nothing more complicated than a glass of water on your nightstand tonight. If this gave you something useful, go ahead and subscribe. That's exactly what this channel's built for. Calm, honest, practical guidance without the extremes you see everywhere else online.